A few weeks back, I got a phone call, and the phone call was from my doctor. And this is what I discovered in that moment. In that moment that you get a phone call from your doctor, you realize as much as you want your doctor to be available when you call them, it is something that is not necessarily reciprocated. Like, you don't necessarily want to hear from your doctor. Like, anytime your doctor is calling you, this is not a good thing. Anyone know what I'm talking about? Yeah, exactly. So a few weeks back, it's a Monday morning, and normally I work Mondays, and so I was in early. It was actually, no one was really here at the office yet, and Nick was here. He was sitting with me in my office, and my phone rings, and I see that it's my doctor, and I answer it, and it was certainly one of those phone calls you don't necessarily want to have. We start talking, and he begins using terminology toward me, describing me that you never want to hear somebody use to describe you. He started using words like concern, and I don't like that. I don't want my doctor concerned for me. That's like, can we talk about something else, right? And then he went on, and he used words like troubling, and it looks like there may be, and those kinds of things. And eventually, we were talking about things that were going on inside of my cranium, inside of my head. Eventually, he used the word tumor and said, there are some things going on, and we definitely need, based on the tests we had already done, we need to continue doing some testing. And I hung up the phone, and Nick was obviously sitting there, and he looked at me, and as much as we joked back and forth, he looked at me and he said, what just happened? And I just looked at him and I said, I might have a brain tumor. And the next several hours were those several hours you spend Googling, what does it mean if I have a brain tumor, right? And so I'm on the Mayo Clinic site, I'm on the WebMD site, and pretty soon, I'm growing third appendages and all these other things, right? You do that, right? Like, you go online, you look this stuff up, and you go a little bit crazy. And so I started doing that. I started just obsessing, started looking at what was going on and thinking about it. And I'll say this, it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter what circumstances you are in life. There's something that happens when somebody says those kinds of things to you that put life in real clear perspective. Do you know what I'm talking about? Some of you know this firsthand. You know that when somebody says things like this to you, suddenly life takes on a completely different shape. And this all happened for me on a day in particular that I was actually leaving town and going to New York City. And so I get this phone call in the morning. Later in the afternoon, I've got to go get on a plane, fly to Seattle, make a connection, fly to New York, and spend a week essentially by myself dealing with what just has been announced to me. And so I did just that. I got the phone call and then really went, and later in the day found myself sitting in airport terminals thinking about what this could mean. And that particular day, my girls were singing in a choir concert at Ferris, and this is just a few weeks back. And I'm just like, man, I don't want to leave them. I want to be there. Things started shifting for me. And then I got on a plane and I did what you never want to do. And that's really just sit alone for hours with strangers, right? So I'm sitting alone by myself on this plane all night long. I'm supposed to be sleeping. It was a red eye, and I had very red eyes by the time I got to New York because I didn't sleep a wink. And what happened in the whole mix of what was going on is I discovered something. And this is what I discovered in that day and then the couple of weeks that would follow that. And this is what it was. I discovered what really matters. That's what I discovered. What really matters. And if you want to ask the question, what really matters, ask somebody who's gotten a phone call from the doctor where they use that sort of terminology. Because you find out really quickly. Ask somebody who gets on an airplane with a bunch of people and just listens, and you observe life and you hear the things that people are talking about, and you start to figure out what really matters based on what really doesn't matter. Like people waiting in line at ticket counters and getting all upset because they're going to miss a flight, that really doesn't matter. And you discover that really quickly. Kids staying quiet on a plane, as much as I would have loved it for my sleep, it really doesn't matter as much as the parents are concerned and worried about the disturbance their kids are making. The arguments you hear couples having on an airplane about their life and what they're doing, it really doesn't matter. Where you're going on vacation in 6 months, none of it. You start listening and you realize none of this stuff really matters in the larger scheme of things. None of that really matters. You start to figure out what really does in those sorts of moments. And I want to just share this with you, so like to relieve the pressure, like pop the balloon in the room right now that exists. I got back from the trip from New York. We had our Easter services, went on spring break, was still kind of traveling, and then I got to do the whole MRI in the tube thing. How many of you have done this? Yeah, okay, so you guys can identify. Essentially, those of you that haven't done this before, the rest of us will tell you. They put you in the smallest tube humanly possible. It's like being shoved into a tube of toothpaste. They put you in this thing, they roll you in, and then they run jackhammer sounds over your head all day long, it seems like. Like for an hour, it's just constant jackhammering on your head. And at first, when I first went into this thing, I thought, I'm going to get a nap. Like, I love naps. Like, this is a nap, and like nobody's can say anything because I don't really have a choice. And then every time I would start to fall asleep, they would change the jackhammer sound to another jackhammer sound, and it would wake me up, and I was like, this sucks. Okay, now this really sucks. You're not letting me sleep. I might have a tumor. This whole thing's going on, right? I got the results back, and the nurse actually chuckled on the phone with me, and she said, there's nothing there. Like, there's nothing, as much as all the indications, and I can tell you some funny stories, as much as everything said there should be, there's nothing. And so, instant relief, right? When this happened, I was at the office when I got that phone call, and most of the people in my life did not know this was going on. In fact, one of my daughters found out about this during the first service while she was listening, and she's like, thanks, Dad, for letting me know. And I was like, I thought I kind of hinted at some things, But I went and I told some members of our staff, and that day we were doing a staff lunch thing, and we went to go get pizza, and we're sitting over pizza, and one of my very wise friends, while everyone's talking and bantering and kind of just joking around, and I was kind of dealing with all the euphoria that you feel when you realize you're not dying, at least not yet. I'm going to eventually. It's inevitable, but not in this moment. Once you realize that, and it was kind of like wearing off, and then my friend, she was sitting next to me, and she looked at me, and she goes, hey, I'm really curious. How did your perspective change when you thought that this was a reality? And I just went, like everything changed. Everything changed. Like everything. I was telling someone after the first service this morning, like I've had moments in the last several weeks when I've just ached to be around my children, just to be in a room with them and listen to them fight. Like I've just ached, like things that I used to fight about, I don't fight. Like just, there were so many things. And I started sharing that with her. And what's interesting in that wise moment that she had of saying, and she was so inquisitive, she really wanted to hear, like, tell me, like, how did this impact your perspective? And when she asked that question, what I realized was true of her was also true of me, and I think it's true of a lot of us. And that's that when we are given the opportunity to see life clearly, if there's an opportunity for us to know what really matters, there is something inside of us that gravitates and pulls toward knowing what matters, like what really matters. And so when you come in contact with a person who has that perspective, or when you bump into somebody who's been given that opportunity to kind of throw the doors open and see what really is important, and there's something in you that says, I want to know, like, tell me what it is that you have to say about my life, because I want my life to be lived with that sort of purpose, right? Like that's something we all want. And what's interesting about all of this is we come to this series, the end of this series called Take the Land, and the life of Joshua comes to a close. And what's really fascinating is now with Joshua, we get an opportunity to look at his life and get perspective from him from that same point of view. Here's what's fascinating. As much as you would like the book of Joshua to end with Joshua kind of riding off into the sunset and the end sign dropping down and everybody goes home happy, the book of Joshua actually ends with the death of Joshua. That's where the whole thing comes to a close, is Joshua dies. And it's a very real thing that takes place. And in the middle of this, what we see is Joshua, this guy who has led the people of Israel, and even in this series has led us in many ways to understand the importance of life and what matters and what we should be pursuing in our life. We get an opportunity to see him now talk and speak with this wealth of knowledge that says, my life is about to come to an end. What really matters? And so he does exactly that. And it's an unbelievable statement that he makes. So if you have your Bible, I want you to open up to Joshua chapter 23. There's 24 chapters in Joshua. We're going to kind of walk through these last two chapters and look at this. And what we see, what we look at today is what Joshua decides. This is his final rally. This is his final speech, his final conversation, the final charge that he gives to the people of Israel. We're going to see, like when Joshua got to that moment, when he got to the point in time when he said, I don't have any time left, I need to tell these people one more thing. This is what Joshua had to say. And you're going to see it is the key to everything that we've been talking about through the entire course of this series. So Joshua chapter 23, we're going to start reading actually in verse 2. It says this: Joshua summoned all Israel, its elders and heads, its judges and officers, and said to them, I am now old and well advanced in years. Those of you that were here last week, you know that he knew this because God was telling him this recently. Also, I think like he was coming to this realization. He says, I'm old, I'm well advanced in years, and you have seen all that the Lord your God has done to all these nations for your sake. For it is the Lord your God who's fought for you. Behold, I have allotted to you as an inheritance for your tribes those nations that remain, along with all the nations that have already cut off, from the Jordan to the great sea in the west. The Lord your God will push them back before you and drive them out of your sight, and you shall possess their land just as the Lord your God promised you. Then Joshua kind of goes on, he's encouraging them, he's challenging them, and then you get down to verse 14, and in verse 14 he says this, and now I am about to go the way of all the earth. I got to say, like every time I read this week, all I could picture was Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce saying, my heart is sick and sad from where the sun now stands. I will fight no more. Like I just had this image. Anyone else know that? I grew up in Arizona, and please don't tell me I know more about Washington State history than you people, right? Come on. So anyways, I just kept thinking about that. I am about to go the way of the earth, is what Joshua says. And he says, you know in your hearts and your souls, all of you, that not one word, he says, I want you to know this, like I'm about to go, I'm about to be done, but I want to remind you that not one word has failed of all of the good things that the Lord your God promised concerning you. Like everything that God promised you, all have come to pass for you, and not one of them has failed. So Joshua, he's beginning this final word to the people of Israel by reminding them of their history. It's like Joshua's pulling up the chair on the porch and he's rocking back and forth and he's saying, guys, do you remember? And he just kind of goes on and tells a story. And everyone's like, yeah, we remember. Yeah, do you remember that, right? Like God came through. Oh, hey, remember that time when? And he's telling the stories. Remember this. Remember these moments. Remember these times when God made a promise to you and then God came through. Do you remember those things? He's just naming all these cool things that God did. And why do you think he does this? Why would Joshua, as he's beginning to tell them these final words, why would he pause in this moment to say, guys, let's look back over our shoulders and let's remember what God has done? Why would he do this? He's doing it because every time that you and I are going to step out in faith, every time that you and I are about to make a decision for God, every time we're going to do something that's going to stretch that faith muscle that we have and we're going to really begin to rely on what God has said to us, anytime we're going to do that, we need to be reminded of what God's done in the past. Because there's power in the present when we see and understand what God has worked in our past. Are you with me in this? Like there's power in our present when we understand the way that God has worked in our past. There's something that happens in the present tense when we can look back on our situation and we can say, I can see God working in the past. And because I see God working in the past, I now have the ability, I have the power, I have the strength, I even have the faith to do things now in the present. Like maybe you look back in your life and you say, there are these days. Maybe for some of you, there was like one particular moment, or maybe there's like a lot of these kinds of moments where you look back on your story and you say you came to a crossroad, and at that crossroad there was a choice that was going to need to be made. Like there was that moment where you said, I've got to do this thing, and there was a hard choice in it. Like you knew, like the thing that God wants me to do, it is not the easy way, it's not the way that's going to get pats on the back, it's not the way that I'm going to make more money, but it's the way that I think God wants me to go. And you make that decision, and when you make that decision, what you discover is God's faithfulness. When you look back on those those moments and you go, man, I remember how anxious I was. I remember how insecure I was. I remember not knowing if I could trust God. When you look back and you see that you following God was met with His faithfulness in your life, that gives you strength and power for now. That means now in this moment, when you come to this crossroad, you say, God, I think I can trust you because of what you've done in the past. Sometimes it's not even that. Sometimes it's not even that there was some sort of decision and that we even had a part of it. Sometimes we can look back in our life and there's just like a blender of chaos, right? Like you look back and you see that there were these seasons or these times when things were absolutely chaotic. They were a mess. And all of a sudden, like as you look back on that, you see that there was a new relationship that cropped up in the middle of it. Like somebody suddenly entered the chapter that you were in your life and they started walking along life with you. And you look back and you go, man, I don't know if I could have made it if it wasn't for that person who mysteriously showed up. Or maybe you ended up moving and you left the town you were living in, or you left the job you were working in, and you look back and go, man, I remember that being so crazy and I didn't want to move and I had to move and I did. And now I look back and I can see, right? Or I can see that change in the job and how I thought I was going to be there the rest of my life, but now I know. Just like we have those moments where maybe we didn't even decide anything, but we look back and we see the hand of God working. In all of those moments when we see God's faithfulness, we have power in the present. We have power in these moments. Like there is something about looking back and seeing God at work that gives us strength. Like we made that hard choice or He brought us through. That's why we use the phrase looking back. How many of you have said this? You've said, well, looking back, it all makes sense. Right? Like, raise your hand if you've ever said that. Looking back now, it all makes sense. We say that, and what we're acknowledging in that is, looking back, God did something through those circumstances, and now it all makes sense. Maybe it didn't at the time, but because it didn't at the time, it means it doesn't have to make sense now in order for me to experience God in this moment. There's power in the present when we see God working in the past. That's why Joshua starts this way. And the present for Israel, the present circumstances that they're facing, this is certainly a time in which they need to see God's faithfulness in the past. Like Joshua is going the way of the earth. You wonder if that flew. Did anybody go, wait, Joshua, what are you doing? Nobody, he says this, right? You're going the way of the earth. And then you think about what that would have done in everybody. Wait a second, Joshua, you've led us every step of the way. Yeah, we followed God, but we followed God through you. You're the one that's been God's voice. You've been the beacon. You've been the one that's been guiding us so that we could follow God. And now you're telling us you're going the way of the earth? If that means what I think it means, this is a moment in which we should be fairly nervous. This could be pandemonium, right? This could be nervous. Basically, they're looking at this and saying, what are we going to do, right? We had Moses, we had Joshua, and now you're leaving us? What are we going to do? Whenever we ask, what am I going to do? When that question starts to stir and come out of our mouth, that is a paralyzing question that identifies the conundrum that we find ourselves in. Whenever we say, I don't know what I'm going to do. Whenever we say, man, what am I supposed? Whenever we start asking those questions, what that reveals is that you and I have entered into a situation or a scenario where the way or the direction that we have in front of us is not clear. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. And that can paralyze us. We ask because we don't know, what's going to happen in this? And so this comes up in our life. There are moments when the bottom just falls out of our life, right? Somebody leaves or somebody bails, and maybe it's a spouse, or maybe it's a business partner, or maybe it's someone in your family, and they just leave, and it's just this pain. There's this sense of what am I going to do now? What am I going to do now that they're gone? What is my life going to look like? How do I live my life in a chapter that I never would have written for myself? What do I do in this? What do I do when there's not enough money? What am I going to do when there isn't enough finances to resolve whatever issues in front of me? What am I going to do? There's a tension in that. Or maybe there's a moment in which money can't solve it. What if you can throw all kinds of money at something, and no matter how much money you throw at it, it doesn't seem to resolve it? What do I do when? What do I do in these moments? See, these things come up. We have phone calls from doctors. We have letters that arrive in the mail. We have moments of panic. There's sadness that we suddenly feel, and the sadness doesn't go away. There's a darkness that comes over us, and we can never seem to see the light of day? What do we do in these moments when it isn't clear? What do you do when you're bored? What do you do when you're just questioning the meaning of your life? What do you do in these moments? See, as much as we like to look at Israel and say that was their circumstance, this is our circumstance. And we're the ones that say, in the same way that Israel is, what am I going to do? And Joshua has an answer. Here's what you're going to do. Here's what you need to know. Here is what you need to understand. We've looked at your past. You know God's been faithful. Now this is what you and I need to do when we hit that crossroad and we don't know. He starts in a very interesting place. In chapter 24, Joshua says this to all the people. Verse 2. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel. This is really interesting how he does this. Long ago, your fathers lived beyond the Euphrates. Terah, the father of Abraham and Nahor, they served other gods. Then I took your father Abraham, who had many sons. And many sons had Father Abraham. Thank you. A couple of you went to Sunday school as children. I just wanted to make sure you're all awake, right? That's a song we hope stays in Sunday school, right? So then I took your father Abraham from beyond the river, and I led him through all the land of Canaan and made his offspring many. Really interesting thing. Here's what you need to do. You don't know what to do with your life. Here's the last thing I want you to understand. He starts by saying, you remember Abraham? Father Abraham, he started off in this land called Ur. And it's really interesting that Joshua starts this. He starts by saying, Abraham started by living, like his story began in a land where people worshipped a variety of gods, one of them being the moon god. And their life was revolving around trying to keep the moon god happy. It was a very dysfunctional relationship that literally resulted in individuals sacrificing their own children to try to appease this angry, upset God that they believed was in control of the world that they lived in. Joshua begins this by saying, do you remember that Abraham came from there and what God brought Abraham out of? Like, do you remember that that's what you come from? That your family used to worship the moon god? And do you realize what he's done? He starts here and then he moves to this next thing. Verse 6. He says, Then I brought your fathers out of Egypt, and you came to the sea. And the Egyptians, they pursued your fathers with chariots and horsemen to the Red Sea. And when they cried to the Lord, he put darkness between you and the Egyptians and made the sea come upon them and cover them. And your eyes saw what I did in Egypt. So he starts with Ur and he says, do you remember Abraham came from there and God brought him out of there? And then do you remember that you guys landed in Egypt? And in Egypt had a totally different set of gods. And those gods actually, the worship of those gods resulted in you guys being enslaved and you guys building the pyramids and you guys, living this horrible life in bondage. Do you remember that there were the gods in Egypt and the gods in Ur? And I brought you out of both of those, like from one and then the other. And now I bring you to this point. I bring you to this place. Like your lineage is really interesting. That's what he's reminding them of. And then in verse 8, he says, Then I brought you to the land of the Amorites who lived on the other side of the Jordan. And they fought with you, and I gave them into your hand, and you took possession of their land, and I destroyed them before you. And I gave you a land on which this is verse 13, I gave you a land on which you had not labored, and cities that you had not built. And you dwell in them. You eat the fruit of the vineyards and the olive orchards that you did not plant. So check this out. Listen to what he's doing here. He's saying, listen, I've brought you out of all of these places where all of these people worshipped all of these different gods. There was Abraham back in the day when he was Abram worshiping the God of Ur. And then there were the Egyptians and their gods. And now surrounding you are the Amorites and their gods. He's leading to the most important thing he's ever going to say to them, the last thing he would speak to them. What is he doing talking about Ur in Egypt and now the land that they're dwelling in the Amorites? What does this have to do with knowing how to respond in the present? The next verse, verse 14, makes it painstakingly clear. Listen to this. Now, therefore, now that you've listened to everything I just said about Ur and Egypt and the Amorites, because of that, now, therefore, fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in faithfulness. Put away the gods that your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt and serve the Lord. And if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods of your fathers served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Joshua's reminding them, like, guys, there are all of these different gods in Ur and in Egypt and in the land that surrounds you. And when you come to the question of what it is that you're supposed to do, when you wonder at the crossroads, what's my next step? And you're worried about what action you're supposed to take. When you get to that point, he says, you choose this day whom you will serve. You choose. If you want to know what decision you're supposed to make, it begins with you understanding who it is, what kind of God it is, where this God comes from, and what he's told you. Like it starts there. What has this God said to you, and who is he? Choose this day whom you will serve. Choose. Choose. You choose. You choose. I love that Joshua says, I know what I'm choosing. You choose. This is your choice. Choose between the Sumerian gods. Choose between the Egyptian gods. Choose between the Amorite gods. Or choose the Lord. The choice is yours. What will your choice be? I think there is this very brilliant and beautiful thing that's taking place as he does this. And he's pointing out these three distinct choices other than God. And it's interesting because he very easily could have just said, don't worship gods, lowercase g, and worship God, uppercase G, right? Like he could have just done it like that. Why does he take the time to talk about all these different reference points? Could it be that Joshua was pointing to realities that existed then and realities that exist today? There's something fascinating in this. Think about what this means. When he talks about Ur, what's he referencing? He's referencing the family of origin from which the people of Israel come from. He's saying, I want you to look back at your past, and I want you to remember where you came from. And what he's acknowledging is that all of us, every single person that was in Israel and every single person today, all of us have lineage. All of us have DNA. All of us have genetics that have been passed to us. All of us have values that are part of the home that we grew up in. All of us have priorities that are things that our parents ingrained in us. Some of those things good, some of those things bad. But all of us have this household that we come from. And sometimes that household that we come from, sometimes our past, sometimes our old nationality, sometimes our old way of thinking, sometimes our old sociology, whatever it is, this place that we come from, this place that we draw our roots from can become so strong and so powerful that it overrides everything that God wants to do in our life. We carry with us, whether we like it or not, the old gods of our parents, the old gods of future generations. We can drag those things into our present. He mentions, Joshua looks and says, listen, I want you to acknowledge the fact that you come from a place like Ur. What are you going to do with the gods that your fathers worshipped? Or Egypt. What is Egypt? Egypt represents their slavery. And how do we worship? We worship with our resources, with our time, with our energy, with our money. Think about all the things that we give ourselves to, that we find ourselves in bondage to. Think about the things that we gravitate towards, trying to resolve uncertainty in our hearts. Trying to feel secure, trying to numb pain, trying to just enjoy a little bit of life, whatever it is. Think about those things that we're given to, that we run to, that end up putting us in bondage and enslaving us. There are things that we worship. There are things that when we come to the crossroads of life, we make decisions because of what those things have been in our past or what they could offer in the present. And when we pursue those things and we go down that road, they wind up enslaving us. Joshua is pointing these things out. Yeah, there's things from your past and your family, and then there are things from your past and your behavior. There's things that you've chosen that can enslave you. And then there's the Amorites. And what are the Amorites? Well, he's saying the culture around you. Yeah, maybe you've rejected the gods of your fathers, and maybe you're not given to the gods of the Egyptians, but what about the culture that's around you? What about those things? So we have this tendency to allow culture to define what success is. We have this habit whether you're a Christ follower or not, we have this habit to allow our society to define what the purpose of our life is really about, what really matters, where we find value. We will default to the culture around us. We'll just look around as anyone else does and just look for the answers to the problems that we're facing, to the direction we should go at any given point. We allow culture to shape us. So Joshua's saying, look around your life. Look at your life. And you've got all these different places where you can choose different directions. You can choose your history. You can choose the things that enslave you. You can choose the culture around you. Or you can choose God. And that's when he says, as for me, as for my house, we will serve the Lord. That's it. And that was the character of Joshua. That wasn't an empty statement. That wasn't something Joshua just said and people were like, cool, great speech, man, great job. No, he lived this. Like Joshua lived this. He chose and he chose and he chose and he chose, like over and over again. You look back at the life of Joshua and you see him making this statement at the end of his life. It was not the first time he had ever decided to serve the Lord. It was a statement that encompassed all of his life and the decisions that he made. When Joshua faced a crossroad, when he faced a decision, when there was a tension in his life, he chose. And it was a lifetime of choices. It was a lifetime of crossroads. And time again, when faced with the option, which will I choose? Joshua chose the Lord. That's what this is all about. And now he looks at Israel and he looks at us and he says, the choice is yours. It's your choice. This is your decision. This is your opportunity. And if you look at the book of Joshua and you were to walk through everything that we've looked at in all of these stories, you'll notice that there is this thread that runs through all of these encounters. And it is the thread of personal responsibility or personal choice. All of us have the opportunity. All of us have this moment in which we get to choose the direction of our lives. You look at Joshua, he had to choose. Very beginning of the book opens up with Joshua choosing which direction he would go. If you look at Rahab the prostitute, she chooses, she makes a decision, and out of that decision there are implications, not just for her, but for her family. The people of Israel, they had to choose time and time again whether or not they would trust God. They had to make the choice. Achan chose. He made the wrong choice. We looked at that, but he still had the responsibility to choose. Caleb chose. There are stories we haven't looked at in this, and time again you see this thread that you and I have the responsibility to make decisions for ourselves. Not just the responsibility, but we have the gift of that. See, the emphasis through this whole thing is that choice makes a difference. You look at the deciding points in the life of Israel, and you see that there's a man or there's a woman who made a decision, and it changed the course of history for that person and for that family, and oftentimes for an entire group of people. The decisions that an individual makes matter. That's what this is saying. Future generations are impacted. Your choices, my choices, the decisions that you and I make, they are not made in a vacuum. You and I don't make choices and they're played out on a movie screen or played out on a musical theater of some sort, and somehow you can just kind of walk out and ignore that it ever happened. No, the choices that we make, they last. Our choices and your choices, the decisions you make every single week, they are present in history and they make an impact. It makes a difference. We're being reminded over and over again in the book of Joshua, do you know who you are? Like, you're not a puppet. You are not a machine. You have the ability to choose. You don't obey some universal law of cause and effect. You're not given to the whims of some angry God. You're made in the image of God, and you get to choose. Joshua, his call to choose is as relevant today as it was then. And here's why. Joshua didn't just choose once. He chose over and over again. And we choose God in every moment of every week. It's an every day, every week reality. We choose God in the everyday decisions that we make. We choose God in the everyday, every week crossroads that we face. In the things that are as normal as any other day, that's when we choose who it is that we will serve. Isn't some bold statement that we make at one moment in a church service and then walk away and expect it all to go that way? No, it is a lifetime of decisions. Choose this day who you will serve. Which means that this, for all of us, that means this week, some of us even today, there's going to be a little crossroads we face. We're going to come up to this thing and we're going to go, what do I do? What do I do? You choose. You choose in that moment. And you change the course of your history by doing that. In our hearts, in our minds, with our time, with our money, with our energy, choose this day who you will serve. Joshua says, it's up to you. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? Because this land you want to take, all the things that God's been revealing to you, the things we've talked about in this series, do you know where the rubber meets the road? Do you know where you actually experience it? When you begin to choose who you serve and when you choose to serve God. That's when it becomes a reality. The people, they respond to Joshua. Verse 16, it says the people answered when he says this. They answer the way that I think all of us want to answer to this. Far be it from us that we should forsake the Lord to serve other gods. You see how they see this? Man, if we were to serve other gods, we would forsake the Lord. And there's a reason for that, and I'll talk about it in a minute. For it is the Lord our God who brought us and our fathers up from the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, and who did those great signs in our sight and preserved us in all the way that we went and among all the peoples through whom we passed. And the Lord drove out before us all the peoples, the Amorites who lived in the land. Therefore, because of all that, we also will serve the Lord, for he is our God. They basically say, are you kidding me? Like when we look back and we see what God did, and we could be this group of people that are still worshiping the gods of Ur and sacrificing our children. We could still be in bondage and slavery. We could be consumed with all of the distractions of the Amorites. But look at what God's done. Are you kidding me? Of course we will serve God. And then what happens next is really funny, because Joshua looks at the people, and I don't know if it's just because he's getting old, and when people get old, they just say what they think and they don't care. I've noticed this. The older I get, the less I care what people think. And I think, like, if I'm this way now, I don't know what I'm going to be like when I'm 90. I'm going to be a mess. But I'll say this. Joshua looks at the people when they say, we choose to. He goes, no, you don't. No, you don't. And they're like, it's like this moment of, like, you read the rest of the chapter and you'll see this. They're like, it's kind of like, wait, what? Like, you just told us to choose and we chose. And then you said, no, we couldn't. He's like, yeah, you can't. You guys are fickle. You're always, like, do you really believe this? Like, Joshua pushes back because he's saying, listen, your life is going to be radically different. You're going to have to break from your attachment to your family history. You're going to have to break from those things that have kept you enslaved. You're going to have to break from the cultural icons that you've been living your life for. Are you sure that you want to do this? That's what they do. They say, absolutely, we insist. We insist. We will serve the Lord. Do you know why? You know why they insist? Because they'd seen God's grace. It's the same thing that compels us. It's the same reason that we would choose. We will not ever abandon our family of origin and the things that come from our genetics. We will never abandon the things that have enslaved us. We will not give up on those things. We will not give up. We will not give up on the cultural idols that are around us until we have fully understood and seen the grace of God. That's what compels us. That's what changes us. The people of Israel, they look and they go, man, we could have been, but we're not. God, we see what you've done. Because I've seen what you've done, I'm going to trust you in the now, and I'm going to trust you in the future, and I'm going to follow you. And when you and I do this same thing, when we come face to face with the reality of our brokenness, when we understand where we could be, when we look at our story and we see that God's hand has entered into our circumstances and He has lifted us out and He has brought us to where we are today, maybe you're not satisfied with today, that's fine, but you know it's better than where you could be, right? When you see that, when you acknowledge God's hand, when you see His grace, when something resonates inside of you that you understand your brokenness, and at the same time you can conceive of God's love for you because of what He's shown you. When you see that love, when you talk about what Nick was talking about and you experience His grace, there's something that wells up inside of you and you say, God, I'm going to trust you with my life. I choose this day to serve you. That's what happens when you understand God's grace. And the only way it happens is if you understand God's grace. He loves you in your mess and has been lifting you out of it for years. So the people, they respond, and Joshua makes this covenant with them. It's really interesting. In verse 22, it says, Then Joshua said to the people, you're a witness against yourselves that you have chosen the Lord to serve Him. Like He's saying, listen, you've said it and now you get to live it. Like, do you believe it? Here we go. And they said, we are witnesses. And He said, then put away the foreign gods that are among you. Do you realize what's happening in this moment? He's calling them out. Like, this isn't something that's like just a possibility. He's saying, no, the foreign gods that are among you, you guys worship this stuff. That's what He's saying. Put away the foreign gods that are among you and incline your heart to the Lord. Listen to the Lord, the God of Israel. And the people said to Joshua, the Lord our God we will serve, and His voice we will obey. His voice, not the culture, not the slavery, not the history. His voice is what I'll obey. And He made a covenant with the people that day and put in place statutes and rules for them at Shechem. And Joshua wrote these words in the book of the law of God. And then listen to this. He took a large stone and he set it up there under the terebinth that was by the sanctuary of the Lord. And Joshua said to all the people, behold, this stone shall be a witness against us. This is really interesting. This stone shall be a witness against us, for it, the stone, has heard all the words of the Lord that He spoke to us. Therefore, it shall be a witness against you, lest you deal falsely with your God. And then verse 28 says, so Joshua sent the people away. Last thing, everyone to his inheritance. He put a stone under the terebinth. Those of you that want to know what a terebinth is, probably at least a third of us, right? That's the bridge to Terebinthia. No, I'm just kidding. It's not that. A terebinth is a tree. That's all it is. A terebinth is a tree. And the terebinth was this tree that was next to the place that the people had been worshiping and gathering. And Joshua says, he takes this stone. And in fact, I want you to do this. Underneath everyone's chair, there's a stone this morning. Reach down and grab the stone. I just want you to put it in your hand. Joshua grabs this stone, and he says, and I'm just going to say this, by the way. His stone was bigger than this one, okay? Just it'd be tough to carry his stone away with you today when we're done. But he takes this stone, and he says, this stone is a testimony to what you've said. This stone has heard what you've said. I love this because it's like he's saying, like, this stone has heard you say these things. And I imagine myself talking to the stone, and I'm not going to get much of a response. In fact, I've never even thought about a stone having ears before. But he says, the stone is heard. And he's kind of like, what's going on? There's like one of these weird moments, like this is such a strange thing. But what he's saying is there needs to be something that is reminding you of the words that you have spoken. There needs to be something that isn't easily changed, that isn't flimsy, that isn't blown or tossed by the wind. There needs to be something that is solid like a rock, something that won't go anywhere, something that will be there. And every time you see it, you'll be reminded of what you've said today. And today, the people of Israel said, we serve the Lord. We're getting rid of all the other stuff. We're going to serve the Lord. So I want you to take a moment right now and just hold this rock in your hand. Maybe just look at it if you just take a moment. And I always want to ask you, what would you speak in this moment that this rock would hear, that would serve as a reminder to you of what God hopes for you? I know for me, in the course of this series, there have been things that I know come from my family of origin that I just need to probably put aside and choose God. And I know there's things that enslave me that I know that when I come to the crossroads, I wrestle with what to do. And I know that there are things from my culture that I let define me and determine my value. And I know that God's saying, leave those things behind. What is it for you? What is the stuff from your family? What's the stuff from your slavery? What's the stuff from your culture that you know is keeping you from serving the Lord? What's that land that God wants you to take? And you go, man, I really want to see health and healing and wholeness in these areas. Whatever that thing is, I want to encourage you to let it be said, and let this stone stand as a reminder for you. I don't expect that you take this with you and hold on to it the rest of your life. Maybe you would. My luck is somebody would find it in the house and throw it in the garden. Like, where'd my stone go? But this is what I do want to encourage you with. I want to encourage you to take this stone this week, put it in your pocket, put it on your dresser, put it on your counter in your bathroom, put it on your office at work. You know what? If you want to do all those things, take it with you, make it your pet rock. I don't care what you do with it. But I want you to take it with you this week. Because here's what I believe. I believe if you lived 1 week of your life, if you took 1 week of your life and you started to live by that sort of commitment, that sort of decision, if you started taking all of the momentary choices, all of the momentary crossroads, all of those little things that are going to happen in your work week, in your home, or wherever you are this week, if you just stopped and you just held this stone in your hand and said, I choose to serve the Lord, what I believe is you would experience a transformation in a week's time like you would never imagine. How do I know this? Because I've lived it. Because I know that when I choose to serve the Lord, when I choose to make His purposes and I incline my ear to His heart and I'm obedient to what He says, there is transformation that takes place inside of me. And that's what I hold for you. Would you pray with me? Lord, I just want to thank you for not being done ever with us. I thank you that you always, always hold out great hope for us. God, I thank you that you're not looking at us in disappointment, but you look at us with love and expectation. You look at our future and it's bright and it's glowing and it's beautiful. And I just thank you for that. God, I pray that you would allow us to trust where you've brought us to. I pray that there would be power in the present circumstances that we find ourselves in because we've known you to be faithful in our past. And I pray, Lord, that you would allow us the courage and the boldness and the trust to choose to serve you instead of our culture, instead of things that enslave us, instead of just our histories. God, I pray for a fresh and new day for all of us. We look forward to seeing how you work in our lives this week. I pray in your name. Amen.